Hi, this is Raylan Barnes, and I'm here with Dr. Sarah Gold McBride from UC Berkeley. Thank you for joining us today.
Hi, thanks. Happy to be here.
So you sent me an image called School Begins. Can you tell us what this is and give us a little background?
Yeah, so this is a chromolithographic print. It's a visual colored image from a weekly illustrated magazine called Puck that was printed starting in the 1870s in the United States. And Puck is an example of a whole series of illustrated newspapers printed in the final decades of the 19th century. Newspapers had been a huge source of information for Americans for decades by the time Puck was first printed in 1871. Starting in the colonial period, American merchants and lawyers and other sort of elite white men in the major cities like Boston relied on newspapers to learn about the economy. But starting in about the 1830s, newspapers exploded in popularity for ordinary people in the United States. Ordinary white men and women could read for really cheap, like a couple of pennies, even sometimes just 1 penny, could read a daily newspaper. And so newspapers, by the time this issue was printed, this image we're looking at is from 1899. By this point, newspapers not only came in a huge variety of types, from different prices to daily publication versus weekly, to images like this beautiful, colorful one, to no images at all. Newspapers came in a whole range of styles, and they also, most importantly, were the main source of information for so many American men and women. It was the main way to learn what was going on in the world, was to read a newspaper. And so by the last few decades, 1870s, 80s, and 1890s, the changes to printing technologies made it possible to reproduce really lavish illustrations like this one on a massive scale, meaning that it was really quick and easy to reproduce lots of copies of images like this one. And so it gave readers this new way of reading about the news. Not only could they read about it, but also experience it in this visual way. There were a handful of really popular titles: Harper's Weekly, Frank Leslie's Illustrated Newspaper, Judge. In California, there was a title called The Wasp. But the one we're looking at here, Puck, was one of the most popular. Puck was primarily a humor magazine. It was intended to poke fun at current events, at politicians. We might think of it sort of similar to Saturday Night Live in that it was commenting on issues of the day. It wasn't breaking news like other journalistic newspapers and magazines. It was really commenting, and often in a humorous kind of way.
It seems a little bit like a meme as well, that it's something that's shareable, visual, and something that could be posted publicly if you liked a particular one.
Absolutely. I think that's a really good comparison. And also similar to a meme is that there's a shared visual language that readers would be able to immediately understand some of the reference points. For example, the most obvious the biggest figure in this cartoon is the man standing at the desk, and that's supposed to be Uncle Sam. And that is a figure that even today we might see and recognize because he has the red striped pants, he has his white hair and beard, but this is kind of a shared visual language that a contemporary reader in 1899 would definitely know who that was supposed to be. So Puck, as I said, it was primarily a humor magazine, but it wasn't just in the business of making fun of stuff. It was also a key source of information for readers. It gave readers insight into how to perceive major issues of the day, issues like political power, women's rights, and issues of race. And in this particular case, race and also imperialism.
Yeah, so let's talk about what's going on in this image. So it's 1899, right at sort of the cusp of the 20th century, and America is definitely going on this imperial blitz. So what's happening in this image?
Right. So you're absolutely right. So in this image, this is called, as you said, School Begins. And so What we see in this image is Uncle Sam in the role of the teacher. And the caption at the bottom says, Uncle Sam to his new class in civilization, with a capital C. And Uncle Sam is saying, now children, you've got to learn these lessons whether you want to or not. But just take a look at the class ahead of you and remember that in a little while, you will feel as glad to be here as they are. So what we see here is that address that Uncle Sam is making is directed to the 4 children in the front row. And if you look carefully at their bellies, they have like a little band around their stomachs, maybe a little cummerbund belt type strip, and they're labeled with who they're supposed to represent, the places they're supposed to represent. So the places from left to right are Philippines, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. Now, this is really significant because these are targets of imperial expansion by the United States or other forms of political intervention. And these children are being addressed as needing a lesson in civilization by Uncle Sam. And he's saying to them, you know, whether you want to learn civilization or not, you will be glad to be here. Just look at the children behind you. And if we look at the kids sitting behind who are, you know, peacefully, quietly reading their books, those children are labeled Alaska, Texas, Arizona, California, and New Mexico.
How can we quickly understand what imperial means? So obviously this is sort of like bringing in new territories, but what does that word mean?
Right. So this is a great question. So imperialism in general refers to one nation state going to a different part of the world and trying to really intervene and even acquire that territory to be to incorporate it or to make it part of its political boundaries.
Got it.
Incorporation suggests in a way that the new land is supposed to be part of in almost an equal footing with existing territory, but that's not what's happening here. That the U.S. imperialism means that the United States, for the first time, is in the late 19th century, so right around this time, 1899, is going to other parts of the world and actually intervening in conflicts elsewhere, and then signing treaties so that those lands get transferred in their, you know, legal ownership to the United States.
So what is the significance of what we would now recognize as states being in the back of the classroom, the well-behaved children who are reading correctly and learning?
Right. So it's not an accident or a coincidence which states are listed here. Yeah. Alaska, Texas, Arizona, California, New Mexico. These were states located in the western half of North America, or in the case of Alaska, further, you know, north of Canada. These refer to states that in the preceding about 50 years, the United States had expanded and taken control of the land that would then become those states. In the case of Texas, Arizona, California, and New Mexico, these states were founded out of land that the U.S. acquired from Mexico after the U.S.-Mexico War, which ended in 1848. This was land that was previously part of northern Mexico, and at the conclusion of that war, as part of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the land was transferred from Mexico to the United States, and from that, these states were founded. Now, what's significant, so in a sense, we see one really significant point we are already seeing in this image is a sense of continuity between American expansion on the North American continent and the United States expansion overseas, that this is being framed as part of one singular process, first to the Pacific Ocean and then continuing, you know, not stopping at the Pacific Ocean, but continuing to expand overseas.
I think another thing that's interesting too is those states that were acquired from Mexico were also places that had a lot of Native American land, but they're being represented now by white children, especially with their rosy cheeks. So really sort of trying to play up their whiteness. And so there's sort of an argument going on about the Americanization, but also the racialization that is happening through this process of becoming American. But we have 3 outliers in this image. Can you talk about the other 3 characters or caricatures that are in the room and in the scene?
Yes, you're absolutely right about the racialization. That is such a striking point about these children in the back, because as you said, the land that California, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico occupied is land that was primarily Native American and Mexican. And here, all of a sudden, we see these children being framed much more as white in their caricatured, as you said, their rosy cheeks, and the clothing that they're wearing is very much normative white clothing. But we got
a Becky with the good hair too.
Exactly. So we do see the little figure in the very back. There's one of these states. It's the one labeled Alaska, where you do see a sort of a greater sense of racialization of that figure. The little girl with the bun on the top of her head, she looks much more racialized as darker skinned.
And it's technically not a state yet, so that's interesting.
Exactly. So that even is a clue of this process, as if by becoming a state, there's this racial transformation of the citizens within that state. Mm-hmm. And so we see immediately the contrast between the 4 children in the front row, who are looking not just grumpy about being there, but their faces are so racialized in the caricature. We see the dark skin, the exaggerated mouths, the body language is very much one of either disinterest or defiance. Mm-hmm. So we see this contrast right away, but you're right. In addition to these characters that are being addressed by Uncle Sam, the 4 children in the front row, the 5 children behind, there are 3 children who are not part of the central scene, but they're still there, present in the room. Now the first I want to talk about is the child sitting next to the doorway, sitting in a chair with a red blanket around their shoulders, holding a book upside down. We can see, right, the A, B, and C is upside down. Mm-hmm. So this one is really striking because this caricature is to represent a Native American child. We have a couple of ways in which the visual language of the cartoon is really revealing here. One is that this child is placed away from the rest of the children. Mm-hmm. He's still in the room, but he's not with the rest of the children being educated. And moreover, he's trying to read a book, but he's holding it upside down.
And I think the fact that he's away also suggests that maybe he's being disciplined or he's in trouble.
Yeah, that's a great point. He could be, he's in a timeout almost.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And it also suggests this very powerful ideology and sort of framework that many white Americans held in the 19th century. And that is that Native American people were primitive, inherently primitive relative to white Americans, and that they were doomed to become extinct, basically. Mm-hmm. That there had been various efforts over the past 100 years to incorporate and to assimilate Native Americans into the United States, a process that was really violent, both literally violent, of course, and also metaphorically, a stripping of tribal identities, of forcing children not to speak their native languages and wear native clothing. But there's this sense by the end of the 19th century, largely, that Native Americans are doomed to extinction, that they're just sort of relics from previous eras of human development. And we see that really represented really strikingly in this figure.
There's some interesting clues as well, because obviously it's a caricature, so it's not accurate, but right. Both the use of the blanket and the headdress kind of harkens or suggests a southwestern tribe or a plains Indian tribe. And these are the tribes that are now in the 1890s, after Wounded Knee and the beginning of the boarding school system, are now being rounded up and being put on reservations, and the important word that you used, the civilizing lessons. Right. So yeah, that's great. Who else do we have in this class?
So right next to this native child is a Chinese caricature. And we can tell that this character is supposed to be Chinese primarily by this long ponytail. Mm-hmm. It's called a queue, that we can see coming sort of almost like floating behind his back. And this is another example, like Uncle Sam, of where the visual language is really striking. Because to an 1899 reader, the queue, that ponytail, was an immediate marker of Chinese identity across all of these illustrated newspapers, Puck and the others. So this hairstyle immediately marks this child as Chinese. Now, what's striking about his location is that he's not actually in the classroom. He's the only figure in this image who's not physically in the classroom. He's on the edge. He's on the precipice, but he's not inside yet. He's carrying what looks to be a book. And he seems to be headed towards the classroom, but he's not there. And what this really speaks to is in the second half of the 19th century, the massive increase in Chinese immigration to the United States, to especially California, initially spurred by the gold rush, as was so much 19th century immigration to California. But later, Chinese men worked constructing the Transcontinental Railroad and worked in many other industries in San Francisco in particular, manufacturing, running laundries, and other sorts of industries. But Chinese immigrants also were targeted as a result of the first restrictive immigration legislation the United States ever passed along the lines of race. The very first two restrictive federal immigration pieces of legislation targeted Chinese people, and especially the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which essentially forbid all Chinese people from immigrating to the United States. And so all of this is to say that Chinese people occupied this really fraught place in American racial society, in American racial identities. That there was a lot of anxiety about what does the United States look like? How would American culture even change as a result of Chinese immigration? So his location here, just outside the door, suggests he's not part of the United States. He's on the edge. He's on the fringe, but he's not part of this community yet.
And I think in the context of some of the really unfortunate and scary xenophobia that's being circulated in our own moment, there's a way that this could be read as the standing at the threshold could be infiltrating the classroom or, somehow entering it and corrupting it, or it could be seen as trying to enter it properly. And so you can sort of do the double analysis of depending on the positive or negative tone that you want to interpret it here.
Absolutely, the tone, and that's something that's really, as scholars, as historians, that tone is often really tricky to read. There's some aspects of this image that are so obvious in the tone, right? If we look at the caricatured faces of the children in the front row, it's so clear to us that they are being racialized as primitive. But there's some other aspects that are just trickier to read. And exactly your point about this Chinese child, we can read him as either a sort of hopeful tone, or as sort of he's about to become part of this multiracial community, or we can read it as an infiltration. I see it. One thing that's significant, and as a historian, and when I'm working with visual images like this, I often find that the clothing and the hair can be super revealing about the message of a particular caricature. This child is wearing what looks like to be sort of a purple tunic, and then almost, I don't think it's supposed to be blue jeans, but they kind of look like blue jeans. But these are actually a lot more similar to, these are very distinct from the way that adult Chinese men are usually drawn in illustrated cartoons in this era. Chinese men, adult men, are usually drawn in with a particular kind of tunic and pant that's indicative, like the cue of a Chinese identity. And this child's clothing, and moreover, I should say too, there's nothing about his the drawing style that makes him look grotesque or scary, like monstrous. And that's also a common feature of Chinese imagery, of Chinese people in this era, drawn with big like pointed teeth or like long nails or other kinds of scary features. And if he had those features, it would make me feel like, as you said, this is an infiltration. But the fact that he's drawn in this more kind of neutral style, it's a little unclear to me then what the tone is of his placement there.
Yeah, that's very helpful. All right, and then who is the last caricature that we see?
Our last figure we haven't talked about, he's in the top left corner. And this is a little black boy who's standing at the top of a ladder, and he's holding a bucket and a rag, and he's washing the windows. And what's really striking about this figure, he's the only character in this image who's not engaged in the educational process in some way. He's not holding a book, as we see even the native figure and the Chinese figure are holding books. He's not being addressed by Uncle Sam. He is in the corner, and he's in a service position. He is there not to learn. He is intended to be there to work, to clean, in this case, the classroom windows. So this immediately we're seeing the way in which this cartoon that's primarily addressing American imperialism and American efforts to incorporate or assimilate or educate non-white peoples in other parts of the world, that is existing in this really stark tension with what's happening with race at home in the United States. The way in which in the 1890s are one of the most difficult and darkest and most violent eras in the 19th century, in the post Civil War era for African Americans. It's a decade of a lynching epidemic. It's a decade in which the United States, the white leadership of the United States, is really not thinking in productive ways about how to incorporate Black Americans into the United States. And we can really see this bifurcation, the separation between the educational mission that Uncle Sam is working on in the main part of the image, with this Black figure, this child who's in a service position.
It's interesting too, because I'm going to assume that the intended audience is a white audience who would be purchasing the puck, but from a historical perspective, this is 3 years after Plessy v. Ferguson. We have sort of the official Jim Crow segregation era beginning, and Uncle Sam has quite literally turned his back to the Black child. So that's interesting rhetorically.
That's a really good observation that we see, and it's amazing, that we think about that expression, turn your back on something, that here it's so literal, right? He literally has his back to this child. And if we look at his face, the boy on the ladder, he's looking towards the classroom. Yeah. He has this eager expression. It's caricatured, I think, too, like the children in the front row seats, but he does seem to have a kind of interest and a kind of eagerness. Like, seems to me to be curious about what's happening in the classroom, even though he is, in the way the image is laid out, he's quite excluded from it. Uncle Sam's body, as you notice, makes this kind of block, this visual border in the classroom that makes it so that one corner of the image is separated from the rest of the action.
The last two things I want to ask you about, and this might help you sort of contextualize it for us as we wrap up, is the globe and the American flag. And so what is happening in this moment, in this image, and sort of when we do this step back, what do you think about here?
Yeah, so this image is all happening on in the back rather. This image is published in 1899, and the big background story is American imperialism, that the United States is joining European nations in annexing, in taking ownership over foreign countries in exactly the places that are shown in the front row. That the Spanish-American War, for example, brings the United States into the club, basically, of European nations that have claimed ownership over smaller non-white parts of the world. And so the globe is signifying the United States' entry into becoming this kind of world-dominating power, into expanding beyond the borders of North America. And the flag too, above we see the globe, below Uncle Sam we see the flag above, are speaking to the way in which the Spanish-American War is sort of transitioning the United States from the stars on the flag representing the states of the United States to becoming this global political power that is claiming ownership over other parts of the world.
Well, Dr. Sarah Gold McBride, thank you so much for learning with us today. This has been very helpful, and I appreciate that you were able to take the time and learn with us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.